In 1977, an early morning call would be made to the fire department in Chicago, US. A maintenance worker had called emergency services to report a fire incident in a certain apartment. When the firefighters arrived, what they found on the scene would horrify them, and immediately the police were called to investigate. But during this investigation, nothing much would be discovered to help solve the case. But that would eventually change 5 months later, and with the circumstances surrounding the case revealing a very strange mystery, which, although it helped solve the case, but till this day, no one could explain how. It just didn't make sense. But before we get straight into today's story, you might consider subscribing, turn on all post notifications, and consider liking the video if you eventually find the stories interesting. It does help the channel. And with that said, let's get straight into today's story. Teresita Basa was born in 1929 in the country of Philippines by parents who were a prominent business couple named Pedro and Socorro Basa. After she graduated from the University of Assumption, Manila in 1960, she eventually migrated to the United States with the intent to study music when she arrived the States. For Teresita, music was her passion, and this was so evident as she eventually obtained her master's degree in music and would also frequently give out complimentary piano lessons to neighborhood children over those years. However, her passion for music was soon overshadowed by this strong desire to help people. She eventually ended up working as a respiratory therapist at the Edgewater Hospital, located in a lakefront community area on the north side of the city of Chicago, Illinois. Known for her reserved demeanor and dedication to patients, Basa quickly became a respected member of the hospital staff. Now, even though she had been in the US for some time, she still had a very heavy Spanish accent, which was evident when she spoke. In addition to her career, by 1977, she continued her studies at Loyola University, where she was actively pursuing a doctorate in music. You see, Teresita Basa was said to be very intelligent by those who knew her. At the time, she was still unmarried and was known to live a very relatively calm, relaxed, and unassuming life when she wasn't working or studying for her doctor's thesis in music. In fact, Teresita lived comfortably, was decent, and was never the type to have any sort of serious issues or quarrels with anyone. It was mainly her, work and peace, with the occasional reports of small fights with her supposed boyfriend at the time. Teresita would continue to live such type of quiet lifestyle until everything changed on the 21st of February, 1977. It was a Monday morning, and Teresita had woken up in her 15th unit apartment in Pine Grove Avenue in Chicago, Illinois. She ate and got ready as usual for work at the hospital. While at the hospital, she met with co-workers, took care of patients who needed help, and it was quite a normal busy day on the job for her. She eventually finished from work at about 5:30 p.m. that Monday evening and then made her way home. While at her apartment, she would receive 2 phone calls, with one of those calls coming around 7:10 p.m. from a friend where they discussed about selling a pair of tickets for an upcoming event, and another at around 7:30 p.m. from a friend of hers known as Ruth Loeb. During Teresita's conversation with Ruth, they exchanged pleasantries and then spoke further for about 20 minutes. And within this time, Teresita would tell Ruth that she was expecting a friend to come over to help her with some work around the house, although she never gave Ruth any further details about who this guest was. After their conversation, Teresita dropped her phone and continued preparing for her expected guest. Some minutes later, Teresita heard a knock on her door. She made her way to the door, opened it, and right in front of her was the visitor, and they would kindly exchange greetings before she ushered her guest inside the house for their planned meeting. At around 8:40 p.m., so over an hour following this visit, Teresita's neighbors named Catherine Naz and her husband married Naz, who were within the apartment block, began to perceive something strange. So they immediately made their way to the maintenance worker and told the man that they thought they could perceive smoke coming from the building, but they couldn't tell where it was coming from. But this would soon change when they began to visibly see signs of thick smoke coming from within Teresita's apartment block. Without wasting any time, the emergency services were called by this caretaker on a report of a blazing apartment. As soon as the firefighters arrived, this caretaker would use his pass key to allow access into the home where the first responders managed to put out the fire. But at a point, every one of them was shocked at what they had just found. Lying on the floor of a room was a nude, lifeless body beneath a burnt mattress, and on the body was a butcher knife to the chest. The body had obviously been stabbed severally, and with the final one being to the chest. The neighbors who were called in to help identify whose nude body it belonged to would positively confirm it to be that of Teresita Basa. The Chicago area police were quickly called to the scene, and with an obvious murder case on their hands, investigators began to look for evidence, even though it was apparent to them that the murderer might have had their way with Teresita before setting fire to her apartment in order to eliminate clues and possible evidence that might be left behind before making their escape. However, the main clue the investigators found at the scene of the crime was a note that read, "Get theater tickets for AS." However, there was no way to tell what AS meant. It could have been the initials to a place or even a person, but there was no way to tell. The investigators had been left with little to work with, as most of the items in the apartment burned in the fire. To the police, they also ruled out any possibility of it being theft, as nothing seemed to have been stolen. Days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, and residents were at a loss for words on who could have murdered such a seemingly calm woman. The Chicago investigators, who had been working hard to solve the case, were still stumped by the crime that seemed to have no motive, no leads, and no chance of being solved, especially due to the lack of witnesses and evidence. After several questioning by the police, friends of the 48-year-old Teresita Basa had no idea who could have wanted her dead. Her neighbors also didn't notice anything unusual on that fateful night, and Teresita's boyfriend, whom she allegedly argued with, was considered a possible suspect. However, nothing came of it, as he had a strong alibi on the night of the murder. And despite the fact that Teresita's body was naked when it was found, investigators would ultimately determine that Teresita wasn't the victim of SA, as was revealed by her autopsy result. And after weeks of intense investigation, there was still no physical evidence to lead police to the killer. By April of 1977, so 2 months after what was now essentially a murder mystery, investigators were really at a dead end, and Teresita Basa's case went cold. However, 6 months into the investigation, an unlikely ally would come forward in the strangest of ways, claiming to have information about Teresita's death. Guys, it's Dark Vic here, and I would like to say a big thank you to everyone who has been consistently returning to the channel to watch the videos. I would also like to say that if you're really enjoying the stories, please do consider subscribing to the channel and liking the videos. It really does help me in sustaining the channel. If you also wish to show deeper support towards the videos, you might as well join as a channel member, as it's been open for a while now. You can also say thank you by using the supers as a way of helping me improve the overall video quality in whatever way possible. Any method of support does mean a lot and would be greatly appreciated. Thank you once more, and with that said, let's get back into the story. Over a month following Teresita's death, a co-worker of Teresita called Remy Bayashua, or Remy for short, whom although both ladies didn't know each other quite well before Teresita's murder, but they had actually met during a brief work exchange. She began to experience something unexplainable. Remy was also a respiratory technician, and she happened to be on night duty in the hospital when she saw someone loitering about the hospital employees' lounge. When she called out to the person turned around, looked at her, and before Remy could make any other movement, this person who had been loitering around quickly approached her, went through her body, and just vanished. Remy fell to the floor and went into a brief moment of unconsciousness, but would later be revived by a fellow employee who saw her. But quickly after this very strange and frightening incident, a very noticeable but unexplainable change came over Remy, as observed by her husband, a surgeon by the name of Dr. Jose Schwarz Jr. And just like the reciter, these couples were natives from the Philippines, and Dr. Jose began to observe as her wife Remy started to display strange mannerisms and also following daily routines he knew for a fact that her wife would never do. Like, she would wake up and perform some minor daily activities which were just not in her nature to do, not since he knew his wife and married her. His wife Remy would also sing songs which he knew she didn't know, and whenever he asked her how she knew the song, she would deny singing the songs or just wouldn't say anything. He also observed that his wife became distant, talked less with him, and would sometimes seem to be in a trance-like state while sitting or lying in bed. Jose and his wife, whom he later told of her strange character, didn't know what to make of this, but the odd experiences continued anyways. Remy, who didn't have an accent, would speak in their native Tagalog, which is the national language of the Philippines, but with this heavy, strange Spanish-sounding accent, while she enters one of her trances, as observed by the husband. This series of strange behavior grew worse as the man began to notice that whenever his wife slept, in between her sleep, she would begin to speak out as if to tell him something, although he never fully understood what his wife was trying to say. Dr. Jose began to fear that his wife was suffering from some kind of psychological sickness, but could not attribute this strange behavior to any sort of diagnosis as he began to look for treatment. This would go on within the space of several days to few weeks, and whenever this happened, her wife would later wake up to claim she was having visions about a very horrific incident. It was like she was reliving someone else's life over and over again. Now, even though treatment was sought after by the couples and the doctors began administering medicines to Mrs. Remy, they would all prove to have little to no effect on her condition as it continued. As for Dr. Jose, her wife's behavior became more bizarre, and not knowing what else to do or who to turn to, it continued to worry the man who couldn't find answers as to what was happening to his wife, especially due to the fact that Remy never seemed to have any memory of whatever her husband said she was acting up or doing during these nightly trances. It continued to worry the man who couldn't find answers as to what was happening to his wife, especially due to the fact that Remy never seemed to have any memory of whatever her husband said she was acting up or doing during these nightly trances. One day, during one of these trances, as Remy sat in bed, staring into the wall right in front of her in their living room, her husband silently watched as Remy stood up, walked into their bedroom, and then immediately fell back on their bed and with her hands and legs in a stiff position. Her mouth opened and she began to speak, except that the voices being heard wasn't that of his wife. As the voice began to speak clearly, Dr. Jose listened clearly to the information that was being passed on to him by who was meant to be his wife, but whose voice clearly wasn't that of his wife, with the voice telling the doctor that she would like to ask for his help as the man who murdered her is still at large. After this statement, Remy immediately snapped out of the trance. During Remy's third trance-like possession on one of these very strange nights, another information would be passed on to Dr. Jose as his wife was still entranced, and this information was just too specific that Dr. Jose knew there was no way for his wife to be making this up. So, he pressed further to know the identity behind the voice, even though he was obviously both surprised and scared, to which the voice answered that her name was Teresita Bassa, a revelation which made the doctor take some steps back. But the voice would tell him that he had nothing to be scared of, and told the doctor, who had been looking at her wife's body all this while, that she would like to ask for his help. As the voice continued to speak, Dr. Jose would hurriedly get a pen and paper where he wrote down some very crucial information, which I would reveal as the story continues to progress. The voice then named her killer and continued pleading with the doctor to help solve her murder, begging him to go to the police before Remy snapped out of the trance once more. But after so many weeks had gone by, Dr. Jose, even with the information he had, couldn't get himself to report to the police as he felt he might face ridicule if he met with investigating officers and told them the story of these mysterious experiences and what the voice had said through his wife. However, the voice never stopped pleading. It persisted, and the episodes became more intense, with the voice becoming angry at him each day for his inaction. 6 months following the death of Teresita, Dr. Jose would eventually pay a visit to the police department in Chicago, where he began to narrate to the officers and later the private detectives in charge of the case on the revelations he had received from his wife through a voice over the past weeks. Now, although the police were understandably skeptical during Dr. Jose's testimony, they eventually would be convinced to bring in the supposed killer or suspect, as the information Dr. Jose had brought in was just too specific to just be discarded. The police knew they had been chasing dead ends after dead ends during the past months of Teresita's murder investigation, so they felt they had nothing to lose. The lead detective assigned to the case, known as Joseph Stachula, didn't know if he could trust this information or not when he heard of it, so he and his detective partner, Lee Shiplin, would later meet with the couples to ask them some specific details of the case to see how genuine their claims were, like if Teresita was both murdered and essayed, to which the couple stated that she had not been essayed. They also gave accurate answers to other questions, which showed that they really knew a lot about the murder case, even though some other facts had been kept under police secrecy. Being convinced on their statement, the detectives decided to do a background check on the individual who had been named as the suspect, and they eventually found out that this named person lived close to Teresita and also worked in the same hospital with the two women. Co-workers also confirmed a certain piece of information the strange voice had relayed to Dr. Jose through his wife, Remy. The information being that this so-called person had indeed earlier planned to go to Teresita's apartment that night for their supposed meeting. On the 11th of August 1977, investigators decided to call in the suspect who had been named and decided to question him regarding the death of Teresita Basa, and this was decided because a very important discovery was made. Investigators had earlier discovered that the AS initials from the note earlier found on Teresita's apartment the night she was murdered matched that of the suspect, whose name was Alan Showery. Alan was a 31-year-old respiratory therapist who was also a co-worker of Teresita's, and although Alan initially tried to get the case against him thrown out because all the evidence came from, in quote, the great beyond, the police would later testify that Alan Showery went quietly with investigators when he first appeared as a suspect in the murder investigation, almost as an acknowledgement of his guilt. While being interrogated, Alan would confirm that he went to Teresita's apartment to repair her television that night, and also claimed that while at the apartment, he found out that he didn't have the necessary tools to do so, so he went back to his home, where he had dinner with his girlfriend on the night of the murder, before drinking and playing darts with a neighbor around 7:30 p.m. Detective Stachula didn't believe this, and as they continued to ramp up the pressure about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, they watched as his alibi crumbled. Now, during one of Remy's trances, when Dr. Jose, the husband, had written some crucial information on paper, well, what he had written as the voice spoke included various items the voice had told him that the killer had stolen from her apartment, including the names and phone numbers of 4 relatives who could confirm that the items were hers. With various information being pieced together, Detective Joseph Stachula decided to bring Alan on multiple occasions for questioning. He would also make contact with Alan's pregnant girlfriend at the time, named Yanka Kamluk, and asked her if Alan had given her any jewelry recently, to which she confirmed that she had in fact been gifted some jewelries as a late Christmas present. The girlfriend would agree to let Teresita's friends and some family members who had been called from the written numbers to inspect the jewelries in Yanka's possession. And sure enough, they would confirm that some of them were family heirlooms which belonged to Teresita's. Most importantly was a pearl cocktail ring and a jade pendant which Alan had actually stolen. Now backed into a corner and with no way to account for the pile of evidence against him, it didn't take time for Alan to unburden his guilt. He gave in and would subsequently confess after he had been advised of his rights. It would turn out that indeed, Alan Showery knew Teresita Basa from work, and although Alan was in a tough financial spot, She had tipped him generously for helping her with errands and other tasks she couldn't possibly do on her own. Alan stated that he had indeed gone to Teresita's apartment that night following an agreed plan to help her fix her broken television. But while at her place, he saw she had fancy valuables and he began to make plans to return and rob her so that he could get money to pay his rent. When he returned from getting his supposed tools, Teresita had let him back in, and when she turned around to lock the door, he grabbed her from behind and attacked her, stabbing her severally and with a final knife stab, baying, to the chest. He then proceeded to undress her to deceive the police into thinking it was a sexual crime, even though he knew he was only there to rob her of her valuables. However, all he got was $30 and a handful of jewelries which were later found in his girlfriend's possession. He then took her mattress, placed it over her body, and set it on fire in a bid to get rid of any traces of evidence which would enable him cover his tracks. However, in 1979, in spite of this confession, when the time for his trial came, which was sensationally dubbed as in quote, "The Voice from the Grave trial," Alan would have a change of heart and decided to plead not guilty to the crime, claiming that he was just kidding when he made the confession. However, the prosecutor would state that he, Alan Share, weren't kidding when he plunged the knife into Teresita Bassa's chest. It was through the testimony of other 13 witnesses, the Shua's testimony, including Remy's visions, and also the retrieved valuables and confessions, which broke this case wide open. By the 5th day of the trial, Alan would state he had only confessed to the crime in late 1977 after police had fed him information and threatened to arrest him and his pregnant girlfriend on murder charges. Also during this trial, Alan's public defendant would state having never heard that a man had been arrested because of a vision, also mentioning that Remy could have easily faked the possession because she was later dismissed from her job, and that while most people who crossed paths with Alan Share knew of his violent temper and suspected him, that the Shua's family were no exception, as they might have possibly known both the victim and the killer, and not to be involved directly in the investigation, that the couple might have fabricated the whole story in a desperate bid to single Alan out as the killer. But Dr. Jose would challenge this statement, mentioning that while Teresita, his wife Remy, and Alan worked at the same hospital, that his wife had never been close with them. Prosecutors would also argue that even if the Schwartz family had suspicions about the killer, that how was it possible that they knew such precise details about the dynamics of the case and the stolen jewelries, which the investigators themselves weren't even aware of at the start of the investigation. Also, according to the investigator during the trial, whilst the device was an initial tip, the final piece of evidence gathered were developed independently. Evidence gathered as a result of the mysterious voices information pointed to Alan Share's guilt, the state argued. However, the investigators would also look into the Schwartz family as well to leave no stone unturned in their search to determine if they also had any sort of dirty connection to the murder. But, towards the end, they were satisfied that the family had nothing to do with the crime. As for how they got the information, Joseph Stachula would state, "To this day, I'm not quite sure whether I believe how the information was obtained. Nonetheless, everything is completely true." On the 26th of January 1979, after an initial 4 weeks mistrial saw the jury of 8 men and 4 women meet in a deadlock, a new hearing was scheduled, and a month later, which was on the 23rd of February 1979, so 2 years after Teresita's murder, Alan ultimately decided to plead guilty to the killing of Teresita, as well as robbery and arson, and this was just before the new retrial. Now, no one was really sure as to the reason for the sudden change of heart, but at the time, it was widely speculated that the ghost of Teresita Bassa visited Alan Share in his prison cell and persuaded him to confess, but more likely, Alan's defense lawyers suggested that the reason for changing his plea was to receive a more lenient sentence, and this he did against the advice of his lawyers, who urged him not to take a gamble with another jury. However, receiving a lenient sentence he certainly got. Alan Share would later receive a 14-year sentence for his cold-blooded crime, and in July of 1983, he would ultimately be let out on parole, essentially serving just less than 5 years of time. And following his conviction and early release, years later, evidence from an author following the story suggested that he had tried to track down the murderer, and found his native New York City to be the last place he had lived. And while his whereabouts is not known today, if he's still alive today, would be in his late 70s as of the time of telling the story. Over the forthcoming years, most people would continue to ask more questions, with many sleuths trying to explain these seemingly paranormal trances by Mrs. Shua, such as, did Remy genuinely got entranced? Was she able to act as a spiritual medium to the other world? Or did she simply overhear Alan talking about his upcoming work to help Bassa with some work? Or could she have been a co-conspirator or fake? Did Alan Shawry really did kill Teresita Bassa? Why did he confess when he was so near to walking free? Furthermore, there was also said to be some evidence that Remy and Allah may have had some workplace conflicts, suggesting some kind of personal relationship between both. Some people have also suggested that Alan had complained about Mrs. Shua's work quality during their time at work, thus leading to her being fired from the hospital. In fact, some would say that her psychic symptoms allegedly started shortly after her termination. Other theories ranged from a possible subconscious fear or aversion Shua may have had of Shawry, or Shua witnessing or overhearing Alan Shawry talking about his involvement, but not knowing how to express the information, while others have held the story up as shining proof of paranormal phenomena. But others have also questioned, was the alleged relationship between Remy and Alan personal enough that she could have known the details of a murder? Could she have heard Alan speaking about his involvement in the murder? But how would she have known the details of the murder, or how to contact the specific family members that could identify the stolen jewelries? While on the surface, the murder of Teresita Bassa had gone on to be largely unremarkable, it still was no less tragic for her friends and family. But what made this story actually remarkable was the strange circumstances behind how it was solved. And while Remy Shua would later state not having another such experience, till this day, despite the accuracy of the information she received and the case's appearance on Unsolved Mysteries in 1996, no one has ever been able to explain how it happened, or why it did happen to Remy for her to be able to identify Alan as the killer. People would wonder if it was really Teresita's ghost that really come back from the dead to tip detectives off on her killer's identity, or did her friends and family coordinate to solve her murder? And if they did, why would they pretend to be Bassa's ghost instead of going to the cops directly with their knowledge? Perhaps it truly was Teresita Bassa's spirit all along. But only the dead would know the real answer. In fact, there were just so many unanswered questions, and with the story causing a lot of discussion at the time, with writers and journalists being too involved with it, and even occult enthusiasts would also take this particular case to prove the existence of an afterlife. But whether or not one believes the claims that Mrs. Remy Shua was possessed by the spirit of Teresita Bassa, one thing is certain, that the clues given helped make sure that the murderer was held accountable for his crimes. Teresita had since been buried in her native home of Dumaguete on Negros Island in the Philippines, and the unsolved mystery still remains one of the rare and bizarre cases, especially in Chicago's history, where a ghost was said to have helped solve her own murder.